Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So, today I'll present some research on the way parapsychologists or academic Psi researchers think in comparison to skeptics and lay individuals who believe in Psi. To begin, let's go back to the year 2011 when a significant event happened in the world of parapsychology and arguably in the broader world of psychology as well. So, Dr. Daryl Bem, a well known and respected psychologist, published the following paper in one of the most highly ranked social psychology journals. So the paper underwent peer review and used conventional psychology methods and presented evidence that future events can retrocausally influence participants' responses in the present. So this paper caused quite a stir among mainstream academics and psychologists, and I would say elicited some very strong and arguably emotional reactions from some of these people. So, very shortly after the publication, within a few days, the following commentaries were published publicly. Um, Regarding the paper, the publication, and its findings. It was called An Assault on Science and Rationality. It was called Crazy and a Violation of Deep Belief in Science. So at the time, I had just started graduate school in psychology. And I had my own experience with some of the reactions among mainstream academics to the publication of this paper. Specifically, one of my professors said in the classroom in front of a bunch of PhD students, I will never read this paper because it cannot possibly be true. And this was coming from a very influential decision making psychologist who had made his name working on thinking, rationality, and cognitive biases. So, these kinds of reactions seem to underscore these perceptions among mainstream academics that researchers who work on Psi are somehow irrational and poor thinkers. But for me personally, it made me wonder if these two groups are similar or different in terms of their open mindedness to consider evidence for or against Psi if it goes against their preferred opinions on Psi. So, the reason that people who are one of the reasons that people who believe in Psi or are interested in Psi are thought to be poor thinkers is partially based on a considerable literature linking Psi or paranormal beliefs with various aspects of cognition. And cognitive factors in this context are particularly important because they may influence the ability and motivation of people to evaluate arguments about the reality of Psi and also the reasons that some people may interpret certain experiences as paranormal or not. Um, in some of that literature, there has emerged what is called the cognitive deficit hypothesis of paranormal belief. And it's specifically the finding that, or the hypothesis that greater paranormal beliefs are associated with deficient cognition. And this literature is wide, it's not fully consistent, so it's a little bit mixed, but there is still some support that people who believe in Psi may have poor critical thinking, poor analytical thinking, poor probabilistic reasoning, etc., and emotion based thinking. But notably, a lot of that literature, 60% of these studies are based on studies with undergraduates, and the remainder is mostly mixed samples, undergraduates, and general population individuals. So, in the context of cognitive factors that influence Psi beliefs, I want to revisit the title of the talk and specifically define what we mean by cognitive styles. So, cognitive styles refer to individual differences between people in terms of their consistent patterns of thinking and problem solving that influence how people perceive and process information. So, notably, cognitive styles are distinct from abilities like IQ, and they refer more to preferred ways of processing information. And, um, so, cognitive styles that are related to evaluating evidence and reaching conclusions when faced with a decision or choice are very relevant to the controversial nature of psi because they may contribute to how researchers, whether they're proponents or skeptics of psi, as well as lay individuals, may form beliefs about psi. So, in the context of psi, one cognitive style that is particularly relevant is called actively open minded thinking, or AOT for short. AOT is a disposition toward rational thinking about evidence. So let's say you're faced with an issue, and most people have a preferred belief or opinion, and it is in the nature of most people to go out and seek evidence that confirms your beliefs. However, the AOT dimension denotes the willingness to actively seek out and consider evidence that contradicts your beliefs. And a related dimension is also being open to changing your mind when you're presented with evidence that contradicts your beliefs. And relatedly, AOT also denotes the willingness to postpone decision making until you've gathered sufficient evidence. So, again, as I mentioned earlier, cognitive style like AOT refers to people's motivations rather than their ability to process information. And when measured by self report, higher actively open minded thinking predicts better performance at various reasoning tasks, as well as lower susceptibility to common biases. And importantly, this is independently of cognitive abilities. So, specifically in the context of the cognitive deficit hypothesis, AOT has been shown to correlate negatively with psi beliefs in multiple papers. So, greater endorsement of psi beliefs is associated with lower willingness to consider evidence that contradicts your beliefs. And another cognitive style that I believe is relevant to how people think about evaluating evidence of psi is called need for cognitive closure, or need for closure, or NFC for short. So, this is a disposition toward seeking closure in order to end information processing when one is faced with a decision or choice. So, in simpler terms, if you're faced with a decision or choice, a person who is high in NFC would be very motivated to find a very quick, clear, and firm answer to decide now rather than to consider um, an alternative answer or different alternatives that may be associated with more uncertainty or ambiguity, and it might take longer to reach those alternative answers. Or, in other words, NFC is the need to make quick decisions and make up your mind quickly in order to avoid ambiguity. And again, when measured by self report, high need for closure is associated with closed mindedness and reluctance to have one's knowledge and beliefs challenged. So, in this study, we aim to answer two main research questions. The first one is, do psi researchers differ from lay individuals or lay believers in cognitive styles related to knowledge, evidence, and comfort with ambiguity? There is reason to believe that psi researchers are different from lay believers because they're typically trained scientists and scholars, therefore, likely differ in cognitive characteristics. And also, even though psi researchers may, on average, endorse the reality of psi, or may show up as psi believers on various measures of beliefs, their endorsement of psi is strongly influenced by the published experimental literature on psi. And the second main research question in this study is, do psi researchers differ in these same cognitive styles from skeptics with a similar academic and scholarly training, specifically in their motivation to consider inconsistent evidence and to search for the correct answer? So we hypothesize that psi researchers will show high psi beliefs similar to lay believers or lay people from the general population who believe in psi, but their cognitive styles will be more similar to those of academic skeptics than to lay believers. In this study, we had 4 participant groups that differed in their endorsement of psi and their involvement in academic psi research. So the first group is the academic psi group, which are individuals who have engaged in academic psi research, and they were recruited through email lists like SurvivalNet, PDL, and institutions focused on parapsychology like IONS. The second study group was the lay psi group, who are individuals who identify as psi believers or psi enthusiasts who are not engaged in psi research. And those were recruited through paranormal Facebook groups and organizations like the Monroe Institute that focus on experiential components of psi. The third group, importantly, was the academic skeptic group. And these are individuals who are academic or professional skeptics of psi. And they were recruited among the fellows of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. So these are very, very high level skeptics who have been or part of this distinguished groups that have made a very significant contribution to scientific skepticism. And then the last group, which is kind of like a control for the lay psi group, is the lay skeptic group, who are individuals who are skeptics of psi but not academics. And they were recruited through the Skeptical Inquirer blog and various Facebook groups on skepticism. So the study consisted of an online questionnaire administered on Qualtrics. People were asked questions about demographics, their professional involvement in psi research, optional feedback, and they completed a few self-report measures. The first one is the noetic experiences and belief scale, which assesses psi beliefs and psi experiences as separate constructs. To assess actively open-minded thinking, we administered a 10-item self-report scale where higher score indicates greater actively open-minded thinking, so greater willingness to consider evidence that goes against your beliefs. And a sample item from this questionnaire is willingness to be convinced by opposing arguments is a sign of good character. And finally, we also administered a brief need for closure scale, where higher scores indicate greater need for closure. A sample item from that scale is I dislike questions, which could be answered in many different ways. In terms of, I'm going to briefly go through the demographics. So in both academic groups, it was mostly men, and the sex ratio in the academic side group very closely matches previously published estimates on the sex ratio of parapsychologists. In terms of age, the academic groups were again a little bit older than the lay groups. And then, not surprisingly, in terms of education, as we would expect, the academic groups are significantly more educated with very high percentage holding doctoral degrees. So now let's dive into the main results. First, starting with the group differences in psi beliefs and experiences. So the dot plot shows here individual scores for all participants in the different groups. Dots are beliefs, triangles are experiences, and the red line is the mean of the belief scores. So, as expected, the academic and lay psi groups showed significantly higher psi beliefs and experiences compared to both groups of skeptics that were pretty much at 0. But also, interestingly, even though both the academic Psi researchers and lay believers scored high on beliefs and experiences, the scores for the academic group were significantly lower than those of the lay believers. So now, in terms of the main finding, uh, differences in cognitive style. So there were group differences in actively open minded thinking, but not in the need for closure scores. And specifically, this box plot here shows the AOT scores in the four groups. And average scores in the academic side group did not differ from those in the academic skeptic or the lay skeptic group. So there was no evidence that Psi researchers are any different in actively open minded thinking than skeptics, which is what we expected to see. However, the average AOT scores in the lay Psi group were significantly lower than the three other groups, and notably significantly lower than the academic Psi researchers group. And then one last finding I want to show you is this association between Psi beliefs in and actively open minded thinking. So here we show the association across the entire sample, across all participants in the four groups. So we find a significant negative correlation between Psi belief scores and AOT, such that people or higher endorsement of Psi beliefs is associated with lower endorsement and lower willingness to consider evidence that goes against your beliefs. So this has actually been, as I mentioned earlier, this has been shown in multiple papers already. And we did not find any effect with need for closure. So this is the effect across all four groups combined. However, if we look specifically at the groups grouped by whether they're believers or skeptics of Psi, we see a very differential effect. So when looking at the two skeptical groups combined, this effect effectively gets stronger. However, if we look at the Psi groups combined, the effect virtually goes down to zero. Which suggests that maybe at the high level of belief, there's other factors operating that may influence high belief in Psi. So quickly, I want to share a few participant quotes. So we asked for optional feedback. However, we haven't done a formal qualitative analysis, but there were a few quotes that were interesting to put our findings into context. So some of the Psi researchers had an issue with being asked about beliefs, and one of them said, "For me, it's not about my beliefs, it's about the evidence." Or, "I don't believe things, I take a flexible position that is constantly reevaluated with available data." And among skeptics, some of them said that they're open to all possible answers if they're given the right kind of evidence, which usually meant reproducible lab experimental evidence. And one person even said, "I would need some pretty indisputable evidence, even if I thought something had happened to myself." So, a little bit of discussion. So, this research shows that despite their high endorsement of Psi phenomena, Psi researchers showed no difference in cognitive styles of actively open minded thinking and need for closure compared to academic skeptics. And on average, these groups agree on the principles of good thinking about evidence, which includes being willing to consider evidence that goes against your beliefs, being willing to change your mind when faced with evidence um, that goes against your convincing evidence, and also in terms of their comfort with ambiguity. And so, despite their differences in terms of their opinions on Psi, and despite the perception that Psi researchers are poor thinkers and that skeptics are uninformed dogmatists, these two groups may be more similar in their thinking styles than we realize. Another important point is in terms of comparing Psi researchers to lay individuals who believe in Psi. Um, these two groups differ. And Psi researchers show greater willingness to consider evidence that contradicts their beliefs. This distinction between Psi researchers and lay Psi believers is not made in the literature on this link between Psi beliefs and cognition, as I mentioned earlier. And I think this is an important point, an important distinction, especially for skeptics who are engaging more and more with increasing number of publications of Psi research in mainstream outlets. So, in that sense, it's very important for those skeptics to view Psi researchers as fellow academics who may disagree, rather than people who are just prioritizing their beliefs over the evidence. So, do we have time for this? Okay, well, the only thing I want to mention is that our sample size only allowed us to detect differences of medium magnitude. So if there are any differences that are smaller than this, we couldn't reliably detect them. And I want to thank the Bial Foundation for funding this research. I also want to thank my co-authors and collaborators on this, Dr. Bruce Greyson, Dr. Marina Whaler. I want to thank any participants in my research who may be in the audience, and also want to thank the audience for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Marieta. Questions? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I wonder if there is a large gap between self-report or self-image and actual behavior, because every skeptic says, as soon as you bring evidence, I will change my mind. But actually, that never will happen. So it's my opinion.
Thank you. So this is a great question. And as I mentioned, these cognitive styles, they're basically measuring people's stated motivations, not their actual behavior. But I think, I'm so sorry. I think what is going on here is that, I'm sorry. Sorry. I think people think they're being actively open-minded, but there's also, as some of the skeptics mention, they consider different things to be evidence. There's published research among parapsychology researchers that, again, most of them are most strongly influenced by published experimental Psi research, but also spontaneous cases and also personal experience. Whereas the skeptics strictly say, at least the ones who commented, doesn't matter if I've had personal experiences. The only thing that matters is reproducible experimental lab evidence. Does that answer your question?
I have a comment, but I don't wish anything I say to be misconstrued as criticism of this research, because anything that Bruce Greyson does, I know, has got to be good. But here's been my experience hanging out with people who have high levels of experience. There are certain types of psychic phenomena which has an overwhelming quality, like the near-death experience and a lot of these precognitive dreams and things like that. And the people who have a large number of these experiences, they have no doubt their belief is just totally overwhelming, and it's beyond any type of rationality or reasoning or thinking like that. So I think that's a factor in the nature of the belief phenomena, and also in my own research, it seems that the capacity to suspend critical thinking, which is very unscientific, that facilitates the phenomena. You know, it helps it happen. So I just thought I'd throw that out.
Thank you. And the only thing I'll say to that is, I mean, when we think of the range of personal experiences, a near-death experience is probably, especially if it's a very strong one, it's probably one of the strongest personal experiences you might have in terms of the range of exceptional experience. So,
On the question, you say we believe, the person says they believe, the person that has experience,
Which is also why we asked separately about beliefs and experiences. Were there any other questions?
Wonderful study. No surprise to those of us who have had arguments with true believers. But for the record, I don't like to use the word skeptic, or even pseudo-skeptic, or even debunker. That has a good historical context. I like the word scoffer. Critic, I think it's a very, very honorable term. I think we should all be critics, just for the record.
Yes, thank you.
No more questions? Very quick answer.
Very quick.
Thank you. Just a comment. I like to say that, and I said this before, and probably you heard that Marieta say me this thing before, but being a skeptic is pretty much is a form of identity.
Yes.
Right. So, and in that sense, it's almost like a religion. The reason of why some people feel threatened or attacked when you talk about religion is because religion is part of their identity. And being a skeptic is not only a way of thinking; it really represents identity for a number of people. So, and you heard me saying before that many skeptics that I know are more interested in defending that identity than in knowing the truth.
I agree. I
Right.
will say though, I would say even on the very high levels of Psi belief, I think there are also people who treat it as a religion as well. Thank you.